The dog's name was Rogue, and the first thing he did when Elise Navarro walked through the gate was try to take her face off. She didn't flinch. That was the part nobody in that training yard could explain afterward. Not Lieutenant Commander Brett Halverson, who had ordered her in there as a joke. Not Sergeant First Class Damon Fitch, who had his hand already on the gate latch to yank her back out. Not the 4 other operators standing along the fence, who had placed silent bets on how fast she'd run. None of them could explain why a woman they'd dismissed as a civilian consultant with a canvas tote bag and a laminated ID badge had just walked into a pen with a 110-pound Belgian Malinois that had sent 2 of their best handlers to the infirmary in the past 6 weeks, and was now standing there, completely still, while the dog circled her like she was something he was trying to figure out. Halverson uncrossed his arms. Nobody said anything. It had started the way most bad ideas in special operations start, with someone being certain they were right. The Naval Special Warfare compound outside Virginia Beach had a K9 integration unit attached to it, a small and deliberately low-profile program that trained military working dogs for high-value target operations. The dogs in that program weren't like the ones you saw at airports or trotting beside police cruisers. They were selected at 8 weeks, evaluated at 6 months, and if they made it through the first year of conditioning, they were paired with a single handler and trained as a team for another 18 months before they ever went downrange. The bond between a dog and his handler in that program wasn't a professional arrangement. It was something closer to a nervous system, 2 parts of the same body, each incomplete without the other. Rogue had been part of that program for 3 years. His handler, a quiet and methodical operator named Sergeant First Class Daniel Ware, had worked with him since Rogue was 14 months old. They had deployed together twice. They had come home together twice. And then, on a training exercise in the mountains of North Carolina, a rappelling rope had failed, and Daniel Ware had not come home a 3rd time. The program administrators had done everything by the book. Rogue had been brought back to the compound, given a physical evaluation, assessed by the unit's behavioral specialist, and placed on a reintegration protocol. A new handler had been assigned. Corporal Kevin Marsh, experienced, patient, good instincts. Rogue had bitten him on the 4th day. They'd assigned a 2nd handler, Petty Officer 2nd Class Randall Torres. Rogue had bitten him on the 2nd day harder. By the time Lieutenant Commander Halverson inherited the situation, the dog had been in administrative isolation for 11 weeks, and the unit's senior veterinary officer had submitted a formal recommendation for behavioral euthanasia. The recommendation used phrases like irremediable aggression and compromised operational viability and liability to unit personnel. Halverson had read the recommendation twice. Then he'd filed it in a drawer and called the regional K9 procurement office, because he was not the kind of man who spent 3 years of federal investment on a dog and then put him down without exhausting every other option first. The procurement office had given him a list of 3 civilian consultants who specialized in working dog behavioral recovery. The first 2 were former law enforcement. The 3rd had no military background whatsoever. Her name was Elise Navarro. She was 29 years old. Her file listed her as a certified applied animal behaviorist with a graduate degree from the University of Pennsylvania's Veterinary School and 7 years of field experience with working dogs across 7 countries. Her professional references included a Dutch police dog program, 2 customs and border protection contracts, and 1 line that read simply, Behavioral Recovery Consultation, Undisclosed Government Program, 2021-2022. Halverson had looked at the file for a long time. Then he'd called his aide and told him to get her on a flight to Virginia Beach. He had not told her what she was walking into. Elise arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, when the air off the Chesapeake still carried enough warmth to feel like an apology for the coming winter. She had a rolling suitcase, a canvas tote bag full of equipment whose contents she had not been asked about, and the kind of calm that some people mistake for indifference and other people recognize immediately as something else entirely. She was met at the gate by a petty officer who looked like he'd been assigned the task as a minor punishment. He drove her to the K9 facility in a golf cart without speaking. She watched the compound go by, the obstacle courses, the vehicle bay, the low concrete buildings with their small windows and deliberate anonymity. And she didn't ask questions, because she had done this enough times to know that the questions that mattered wouldn't be answered in the first hour anyway. The K9 facility was a separate building near the eastern perimeter, with an attached outdoor training yard enclosed by chain-link fencing. She could hear the dogs before she could see them, a layered chorus of barks and movement that had its own rhythm, its own logic, if you knew how to listen to it. Most people don't. Elise did. Lieutenant Commander Halverson met her at the facility entrance. He was a large man, over 6 feet, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of physical presence that had probably gotten him through a lot of doors in his career without needing to say much. He looked at her the way men in that environment often looked at her, processing the contradiction between what he'd been told she could do and what he was currently observing, which was a young woman in civilian clothes who looked like she might teach yoga on weekends. "Miss Navarro," he said. "Dr. Navarro," she said. Not sharp, just accurate. He paused for exactly 1 second. "Dr. Navarro, I appreciate you making the trip. Can I see the dog?" He blinked. He had prepared a briefing. He had a PowerPoint. "We should probably go over the background first." "I read the file on the plane," she said. "All of it, including the euthanasia recommendation. I'd like to see the dog before we do anything else." There was a moment where Halverson seemed to be deciding something. Then he turned and walked her toward the facility. She saw Rogue through the reinforced window of his isolation kennel before she saw anything else, and she stopped walking. He was pacing. Not the anxious circular pacing of a frightened animal. Something else. Something with a terrible, contained energy to it, like a machine running at full power, with nowhere to send the output. He was a big dog, dark sable with a black mask, with the particular physical quality of a Belgian Malinois that always made people think of compressed force. Everything tight, everything deliberate, nothing wasted. "How long has he been in isolation?" she asked. 11 weeks. She turned to look at Halverson. "You isolated a grief-reactive dog for 11 weeks. He was injuring personnel." "Because he's grieving," she said. "Not because he's broken." Halverson's jaw tightened. "With respect, doctor, our behavioral specialist assessed." "Your behavioral specialist has a degree in animal science and 4 years of kennel management experience," she said. "I'm not dismissing that. I'm telling you it's not the same thing as what I do." She turned back to the window. "Has anyone spent unstructured time with him?" "No training, no commands, no task, just presence." A pause. "That's not our standard protocol, I know." She set her canvas bag down on the floor, unzipped it, and began taking things out. Not equipment, as it turned out. A worn tennis ball, a small cloth sleeve that smelled, to anyone paying attention, faintly of another dog, a piece of rope. "I'm going to need about 20 minutes alone with him." "Absolutely not," said Sergeant Fitch, who had materialized from somewhere behind Halverson with the air of a man who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. He was younger than Halverson, rangier, with the kind of aggressive competence that sometimes gets mistaken for actual authority. "That dog nearly took Torres's hand off. You're not going in there without a handler and a control line." Elise looked at him. "What's your name?" "Sergeant Fitch." "Sergeant Fitch, Rogue isn't attacking people because he's dangerous. He's attacking people because every human who's come near him for the past 11 weeks has come with an agenda, a lead, a command, a task, a test. He's not a threat. He's a dog who's been alone for 3 months and has no idea why." She picked up the tennis ball and turned it over in her hands. "I'm going to go in there and sit on the floor, that's all. If that dog touches you, It becomes a legal issue for this command, Fitch said. Then you should probably go stand somewhere you can't see, she said pleasantly. Halverson made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Fitch's expression went flat. Sir, Fitch said, turning to Halverson, I want it on record that I am formally objecting to this. Halverson looked at Fitch. Then he looked at Elise. Then he looked at the dog through the window, still pacing with that contained and exhausting energy. Open the kennel, he said. Sir, open it, Sergeant. What happened in the next 4 minutes? The people standing outside that kennel would recount differently depending on who was telling it and how much time had passed. But the basic facts were these. Elise Navarro walked into the kennel alone. She did not carry a lead or a command stick or a treat pouch. She carried the tennis ball and the cloth sleeve and nothing else. She did not go to the center of the space, which is where handlers are trained to position themselves, the dominant, central position, the position that signals control. She went to the corner. She sat down on the concrete floor with her back against the wall and her knees pulled up, making herself as small and non-threatening as she possibly could, and she set the tennis ball on the floor in front of her. Rogue stopped pacing. He stood at the far end of the kennel and looked at her with those amber eyes that always seemed to be running some kind of internal calculation, and she sat very still and looked back at him and did not look away, which is important. Not a challenge, not a stare, just a steady acknowledgement. I see you. I'm not afraid of you. I'm not here to make you do anything. Rogue lowered his head. The watching operators had seen that dog hit 2 grown men like a freight train. They'd seen him work a bite sleeve with enough force to lift a 200-pound decoy off his feet. They'd seen him pace that kennel like a wound spring for 11 weeks, burning through the days, with nowhere to put the grief and the confusion, and the terrible knowledge that the person who was supposed to come back had not come back. What they had not seen until this moment was Rogue take 3 slow steps toward a human being, and then stop and lower his head and make a sound that was not a growl. It was the kind of sound a dog makes when something has shifted, when the static clears, when, in some wordless and inarticulate way, the world makes slightly more sense than it did a moment ago. Elise didn't reach for him. She picked up the tennis ball and held it out in her open palm, not pushing it toward him, just an offering, visible, available, without expectation. Rogue took 2 more steps. Outside the kennel, Fitch had his hand on the latch. Halverson put his hand on Fitch's arm. Rogue walked to the corner where Elise was sitting and stood over her for a long moment, close enough that she could feel his breath on the top of her head. Then he lay down beside her. His chin rested on her knee, his eyes closed. Nobody on the outside said anything for a very long time. She spent the rest of that day in the facility, not with Rogue specifically, but with the whole unit, watching how the other dogs moved, how they responded to their handlers, what the culture of the place felt like from the inside. She asked careful questions and made notes in a small green notebook that she kept in her back pocket, and she was polite and professional and gave nothing away. Halverson had her briefed on Rogue's full history that evening, the deployment record, the training files, Daniel Ware's handler notes going back 3 years. She read everything. She asked about Ware, not professionally, not clinically. Personal questions. What had he been like? What were his habits with the dog? Did he have a particular command cadence? Did he use food reinforcement or play drive? Was there music in the kennel? Halverson looked at her. Music. Some handlers play music in their dogs' spaces. It creates auditory anchoring. If Ware did it, Rogue may be in withdrawal from that as much as from anything else. Halverson went and found Rogue's kennel assignment records, and on the 3rd page, in Ware's handwriting, was a note. Radio on low during rest periods. Classic rock. He settles better. Elise looked at the note for a moment. Then she looked up, and for just a second, something moved across her face that wasn't professional. Something that looked like grief, briefly visible and quickly contained. Do you know what Rogue's verbal release command was? She asked. Free, said Halverson. Standard issue. She shook her head. Not in Ware's notes. He used a different one. She turned a few pages back and pointed. Halverson looked. In Ware's handwriting, under a section labeled Personal Modifications, the word breakaway. That's not a standard command, Halverson said. No, she said. It's theirs. It was their word. She closed the notebook. That's what I'll use. She was back at the facility at 6 the next morning, before most of the unit had finished their PT. She ran a training session with Rogue in the outdoor yard. Not a standard obedience session, not a bite work session. Something harder to categorize. She moved with him through a series of activities that looked, to the untrained eye, like play, but were in fact a precisely calibrated process of re-establishing trust through voluntary engagement. Every choice Rogue made was his own. Every response was invited, not commanded. She was rebuilding something from the inside out, starting with the layer underneath obedience. The layer that says this person is worth listening to, not because they're threatening me, but because good things happen when I do. Fitch watched from the fence. He didn't say anything for the first 40 minutes. Then, he's not running scenarios. Not yet, she said without looking over. The point of a military working dog is that he runs scenarios. The point of a military working dog is that he trusts his handler enough to follow them into the worst situations imaginable, she said. You can't command that. You can only earn it. She sent Rogue through a tunnel obstacle, and he came out the other end clean, head high, looking back at her for the next cue. He's not broken, Sergeant. He's been asking for something specific for 11 weeks, and no one's been able to hear it. Fitch was quiet. Then, what's he been asking for? She looked at the dog, to know that the work still matters, that there's still a point. She pulled the tennis ball from her pocket and threw it to the far end of the yard. Rogue was already moving before it landed. He gave everything he had to someone who's gone. He needs to know that what they built together didn't die with Ware, that it still means something. Fitch stood at the fence for another minute. Then he walked away. He came back 20 minutes later with a cup of coffee he didn't offer her. He stood at the fence again and watched. He didn't say anything else, but he stayed. The confrontation, because that's what it became, eventually, the way these things always do in environments built around dominance and hierarchy, happened on the 4th day. A full training evolution was scheduled that afternoon, a simulated hostage scenario, using the K9 unit's full operational team. Rogue's slot in the evolution had been blank since his handler died. Halverson had filled it with a different dog, a young German shepherd named Ajax, who was solid but not exceptional, and the operation had proceeded with that substitution for 11 weeks. That morning, Elise told Halverson she wanted to run Rogue in the afternoon evolution. Halverson looked at her. He's not cleared, I know. I'm asking you to change that, based on 4 days of work, based on what I know about this dog. Halverson leaned back in his chair and looked at her for a long time. He was a man who was accustomed to assessing risk, and he was doing it now in real time, looking at a 29-year-old civilian who was asking him to put an unpredictable dog into a live training evolution with his people. If something goes wrong, he said carefully, I'm the one who signs the incident report. Nothing will go wrong, she said. You can't know that, but I know this dog, and I'm telling you he's ready. Halverson's aide came and went. A radio crackled somewhere down the hall. Outside the window, Elise could see the training yard where she'd spent the last 4 mornings, and she could see Rogue in his run, sitting at alert, watching the facility door with those amber eyes. Waiting, Stilfy waiting. Fine, Halverson said finally. But you run with him. You're the handler of record for this evolution. If he goes off script, you call it. She hadn't been expecting that part. But she didn't hesitate, understood. The afternoon evolution was scheduled for 1400 hours, and by 13:30 the word had gotten around the unit that the consultant was running Rogue in the scenario. The reaction was what Elise had expected. a specific kind of military skepticism that she had encountered in various forms across a career, spent walking into places where she wasn't immediately welcomed. She suited up in the gear they gave her, a vest, a radio, a mouthpiece for the bite sleeve she'd be wearing on her left arm. She'd worked in field evolutions before. She knew the equipment. The operators around her watched her put it on with expressions ranging from carefully neutral to openly doubtful. Fitch came to stand beside her before she went into the staging area. He looked like he was going to say something caustic. Then he looked at her face and seemed to decide against it. "You sure about this?" he said instead. "Yes, because once that gate opens, there's no." "I know," she said. "I've done this before." He looked at her, really looked at her, probably for the first time. "Where?" She adjusted the vest strap. "Classified." He blinked, and something in his expression shifted just slightly, not respect exactly, but the precursor to it, the first, reluctant recognition that maybe there were things about this person he hadn't been told. The evolution began. It was a building clearance scenario, a simulated hostage situation in a constructed urban environment on the south end of the compound. 3 rooms, 2 objectives, a pair of role players acting as hostiles, and a timer. The team went in 2 by 2. Elise and Rogue were the last element. Rear security and secondary search. The slot that requires a dog who can hold his focus in chaos, who can move through an active environment without reacting to every stimulus, who can wait until he's called and then go absolutely full throttle when he is. They waited outside while the first elements cleared the primary approach. Rogue was on a 6-foot lead at her left hip, and she could feel him through the leather, not the frantic tension of an uncontrolled animal, but the coiled, particular readiness of a dog who knows what's coming and is ready for it. His nose was working. His ears were in constant micro-motion. His eyes tracked every point of entry and exit with the habitual threat assessment of an animal who had done this exact thing in real buildings, in real countries with real stakes. She kept her voice low. She said his name once. He looked up at her. "I know," she said. "Not a command, just acknowledgement. I know." His tail moved once. His eyes went back to the building. The radio crackled. Bravo element moved to secondary breach point. They moved. What happened in the next 8 minutes was, by the account of everyone who saw it, one of the cleaner building search performances the unit had seen in months. Rogue worked with a focus and a precision that made several of the watching operators go quietly thoughtful, because this was a dog they'd written off, a dog who'd been in isolation, a dog who'd been flagged for destruction, and he was moving through that simulated environment like he'd never stopped. The scenario culminated in a room at the back of the building where one of the role players broke from position and ran, which is the moment in any K9 evolution where you find out what the dog is actually made of. The flight instinct in most dogs, even trained ones, can override everything else in that moment. The prey drive kicks in, the scenario falls apart. You end up with a dog who's chasing and a handler who's running behind him, yelling commands that come too late. Elise gave the signal before the role player was 3 steps into his run. 1 word. Not get him, not take, not any of the standard commands. 1 word that was written in the handwriting of a dead man in a file she'd read on a plane 3 days ago. Breakaway. Rogue went from still to full speed in a single motion, crossed the distance in 4 seconds, and executed a textbook-controlled apprehension, precisely applied force, immediately responsive to the follow-on command, 0 damage beyond what the bite sleeve was designed to absorb. The role player went down. Rogue held. Elise called him off. He came back to her left side and sat, breathing hard, eyes bright. The room was silent. Then Halverson's voice came over the radio, from the observation position where he'd been watching the whole evolution on a camera feed. He didn't say anything for several seconds. Then, well, just that, just well. But the way he said it carried everything. The recalibration, the realization, the particular quality of a man who has just been shown that his original assessment of a situation was wrong. They debriefed in the main operations room at 1600. The full team was there, sitting around the long table with the institutional coffee that tasted like it had been brewed sometime during the previous administration. Elise sat at the end with Rogue lying under her chair, his head on her foot, completely relaxed in the way dogs are when they have finally found the right frequency after a long time of static. Nobody brought up the euthanasia recommendation. Nobody mentioned the incident reports from the 2 handlers who'd been bitten. Those things existed. They were part of the record, but they felt, in that room, like documents from a different case. What the team talked about was the evolution, what Rogue had done, what the path forward looked like. Fitch, to his credit, was the one who said it first. He didn't look at Elise when he said it. He looked at the table. He was never unsuitable, he said. We just didn't know what he needed. A couple of the other operators nodded, not enthusiastically. These were not men who were enthusiastic about anything in the ordinary sense, but with the quiet, deliberate acknowledgement of people who have updated their understanding of something. Halverson looked at Elise. I need to ask you something. Okay. How did you know? From the file. From what you read on the plane, how did you know he was recoverable? She thought about how to answer that. She looked down at Rogue, who had shifted slightly so that more of his weight was on her foot, the way he'd started doing in the mornings during their sessions, this small, unconscious claim of proximity. The handler notes, she said. Ware's notes were different from every other handler's notes in that file. Most handler documentation is observational. What the dog did, what command was used, what the outcome was. It's clinical, it's useful. She paused. Ware's notes read like he was writing letters. To the dog, to himself. There were observations in there about what Rogue seemed to like, about which obstacles made him anxious and which ones he ran toward, about the fact that he always sat slightly closer to Ware than the protocol required, and that Ware had stopped correcting it. She looked up. A dog who was bonded that deeply to one person doesn't become dangerous because that person is gone. He becomes lost. Those are different things. And you can't solve lost with a new handler and a stricter protocol. She shook her head. You can only solve lost by helping the dog find a new reason to trust. The room was quiet. Halverson nodded once, slowly. What does the long-term picture look like? He'll need a permanent handler. Someone patient, not too dominant in their approach. Ideally, someone who's experienced loss themselves. He'll bond hard, and he'll be loyal beyond anything you've seen from him before, because he'll know what it cost. She reached down and ran her hand along Rogue's back. He shifted his weight further into her. But he needs the right person, not the next available person. And in the meantime, she said, I'll stay for another 2 weeks and keep working with him. Build the bridge. Halverson looked at her. Your contract was for 5 days. I know, she said. I'm extending it voluntarily. He considered her for a moment. Why? She looked at the dog. She thought about Daniel Ware's handwriting. She thought about the word breakaway and what it meant, not just as a command, but as a philosophy. The idea that sometimes the best thing you can do for something you love is to give it away to move forward, to keep working, to not stay in the place where the grief lives. Because he's not done, she said. He's still got a lot of good work in him. She ran her hand along his ears. And I don't think Ware would have wanted anyone to give up on him, not when he was this close. The 2 weeks became 3, and then, at the end of the 3rd week, something happened that no one had planned for, but everyone, in retrospect, should have seen coming. A handler transfer request arrived from a SEAL team on the West Coast, a petty officer first class named Grant Calloway, who had come up through the K9 program at the beginning of his career, had transitioned to a different specialty for 6 years, and was now requesting a return to working dog operations. His record was clean, his requalification scores were high, his psychological evaluation noted, almost as an aside, that he had lost his father 18 months prior, and had, since then, been described by his teammates as unusually steady under pressure, in the particular way that sometimes follows grief when grief has been properly understood rather than suppressed. Halverson forwarded the file to Elise without comment. She read it in the break room with a cup of tea she'd been nursing for an hour, and when she finished reading it, she sat still for a moment with the file in her hands. Then she went and found Halverson in his office. "This one," she said, and set the file on his desk. He looked at it. He looked at her. "You haven't met him." "I don't need to," she said. "Read Ware's notes and read this file side by side. The way this man writes about dogs. The way he describes what went wrong with his last working animal and what he wishes he'd done differently. The thing he says in the final paragraph." She tapped the page. "He's not looking for a dog to control. He's looking for a partner." Halverson read the paragraph she'd pointed to. He read it twice. "The biggest mistake I made in my first K9 assignment," Calloway had written, "was believing the dog needed to trust me before I'd earned it. I was wrong. Trust moves in one direction first, toward the animal. You have to go there first. And then, if you're worth it, they come the rest of the way." Halverson set the file down. "I'll make the call," he said. Grant Calloway arrived on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks and 4 days after Elise Navarro had first walked through the facility gate. He was quieter than she'd expected. Not closed off, just contained, in the way of someone who has learned to hold a lot inside without it spilling over. She ran their first introduction the same way she'd run everything else, on the dog's terms. No formality, no protocol, no, "This is your new handler, sit, stay, demonstrate readiness." Just Grant in the training yard with a cup of coffee he didn't finish, and Rogue loose on a long line with the option to come or not come. Rogue circled the perimeter twice. He checked the gate. He looked at the facility door. He looked at Grant. Grant stood in the middle of the yard and didn't move. After 4 minutes, Rogue walked to him and sat at his left side. Not at heel position, slightly too close for regulation. The same slightly too close that Ware's notes had described in the handwriting that read like letters. Elise, watching from the fence, didn't say anything, but she felt something settle in her chest, a tension she hadn't fully acknowledged until it released. Grant looked down at the dog. Then he looked up and found her at the fence, and his expression asked a question he didn't put into words. She nodded. He looked back down at Rogue. He reached down, slow, deliberate, giving the dog all the time in the world, and rested his hand on top of Rogue's head. Rogue leaned into it. Just that. Just a hand and a dog, and the uncomplicated, enormous, deeply unscientific thing that happens between two beings when they recognize something in each other, when the frequency finally matches, when the long silence breaks. She left on a Friday. She didn't make a production of it. She returned her access badge, signed her exit documentation, packed the canvas tote bag with its tennis ball and its rope and the cloth sleeve that had done its work and was no longer needed. She walked back through the facility and down the corridor past the kennels, and she stopped at Rogue's Run. Not his isolation kennel, the good one, the one with the radio that someone had set to a classic rock station at a low volume. He was lying on his bed, with his chin on his paws, eyes half closed. When he heard her stop, he lifted his head and looked at her with those amber eyes. She stood at the mesh for a moment. "You're going to be okay," she told him. "Not a clinical assessment, not a professional prognosis. Just the truth, the way you say it to someone you've spent 3 weeks sitting on the floor with, rebuilding something from the inside out." Rogue's tail moved once. Slow, certain. She walked out. Halverson was waiting by the exit. He held out his hand and she shook it. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Not comfortable, not easy. Just true. For what specifically?" "For the PowerPoint I didn't get to show you," he said. She laughed. A real one, short and surprised. "Maybe next time." He nodded once. "I hope there isn't a next time. That would mean we're doing this right." "That would mean you're doing this right," she said. "You were doing it wrong before I got here." He took that without argument. She respected him more for it. She walked to the car that was waiting to take her to the airport, and she got in and she didn't look back at the facility. Not because she didn't care about what she was leaving behind, but because she did. Grant Calloway was in there, Rogue was in there, the radio was on. Somewhere in a file that would never be read by anyone outside that compound, Daniel Ware's handwriting described the small habits of a dog who had loved his work and his handler with everything he had, and who had never stopped being worth believing in. That was the thing about broken, she'd learned. It was almost never the right word. There was a whole vocabulary of human failure hiding inside that word. The failure to look carefully enough, to listen long enough, to ask the right questions before reaching for the easiest conclusion. Rogue wasn't broken. He never had been. He was just waiting for someone who knew the difference.